What if the most important words ever spoken were never fully written down? What if the man whose teachings reshaped the conscience of 2 billion human beings said things, careful things, intimate things, world-altering things, that were heard by witnesses, carried in human memory across generations, committed to papyrus and parchment by devoted hands, and then simply never found their way into the pages of the book the world came to call sacred? This is not a question thrown at faith from the outside. It is a question that has lived within the serious study of early Christianity for centuries, asked by scholars, theologians, archaeologists, and historians who devoted their lives not to destruction, but to a single stubborn pursuit: the truth about what Jesus said, what was preserved, and what may have been lost. For most people who carry faith in Jesus of Nazareth, the assumption is quiet and deeply held. The four Gospels contain everything: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, 4 voices, 4 accounts, one complete and final portrait of the man and his message. The canon, as scholars call it, represents the whole story, and for centuries, that belief has been both a comfort and a foundation, passed down through families and congregations and entire civilizations as something settled, something closed, something whole. But the New Testament, as the world knows it today, did not arrive in its final form all at once. It was assembled, slowly, across generations of debate and discernment and disagreement. In the decades following the death of Jesus, dozens of texts circulated among early Christian communities scattered across the vast reach of the Roman world. Communities in Alexandria read accounts that communities in Rome had never encountered. Communities in Syria preserved writings that churches in Jerusalem might have found unfamiliar. The landscape of early Christianity was not a single unified library with a single agreed-upon shelf of books. It was a living, breathing, contested collection of memories and testimonies and interpretations spread across a world that had no printing press, no internet, no centralized authority with the power to instantly declare what was true and what was not. By the late 2nd century, church leaders had begun the long work of defining what belonged. Bishops wrote letters recommending certain texts. Early lists were proposed and debated. The Great Gathering at Nicaea in the year 325 addressed questions of theology and church unity. Subsequent councils in the following decades pressed further into questions of Scripture. By the late 4th century, the core canon recognizable to most Christians today had taken something close to its final shape. But shape is not the same as completeness, and completeness is precisely what history came, in the most dramatic fashion, to question. In the year 1945, in the sun-hammered valley of the Nile in Upper Egypt, a young farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Samman was digging at the base of a great cliff near the village of Nag Hammadi. He was searching for soft earth to use as fertilizer. His mattock struck something hard. He dug around it carefully and pulled from the ground a large sealed ceramic jar, reddish-brown and ancient, its lid still intact. He hesitated before opening it. Local tradition held that jars like this sometimes contained spirits, but the possibility of hidden gold won over caution. He broke the seal. Inside the jar were no spirits and no gold. There were books, 13 leather-bound volumes, their pages made of papyrus, their text written in Coptic, a late form of the ancient Egyptian language. The books had been sealed in that jar and buried in that cliff sometime in the 4th century, perhaps by monks from a nearby monastery who feared the texts would be destroyed by church authorities consolidating Orthodox teaching. They had wrapped the books in leather to protect them. They had chosen a hiding place dry enough and remote enough to survive. And then they had buried them, and whatever they intended to do next, they never came back. The Nag Hammadi library, as it came to be called, contained 52 texts. Among them was a document that would shake the world of biblical scholarship to its foundations, the Gospel of Thomas. Not a narrative gospel in the manner of Matthew or Luke, with stories of miracles and journeys and a passion account. Instead, it was a list. 114 sayings, each one introduced by the same quiet phrase, Jesus said. Some of these sayings were immediately recognizable, close cousins of teachings already found in the canonical Gospels. Others were stranger, more compressed, more philosophically demanding. And some appeared nowhere in the New Testament at all. But Nag Hammadi was not the first place scholars had encountered this unsettling territory. Nearly half a century earlier, in the year 1897, two young Oxford scholars named Bernard Grenfell and Arthur Hunt arrived in the Egyptian desert at a site called Oxyrhynchus, a city that had once been a thriving center of Greco-Roman and early Christian life. The city had been abandoned and buried under centuries of desert sand. Grenfell and Hunt began to excavate. What they found over the following seasons was extraordinary. Hundreds of thousands of papyrus fragments discarded in ancient rubbish heaps, but preserved almost perfectly by the absolute dryness of the Egyptian climate. Among the fragments were early Christian texts, and among those texts were sayings attributed to Jesus that did not match anything in the four Gospels. One fragment, later identified as a portion of the Gospel of Thomas, predating even the Nag Hammadi version, contained a saying rendered in ancient Greek in which Jesus speaks about the act of lifting a stone and finding him there, of splitting a piece of wood and discovering his presence within it. The image is arresting, immediate, almost mystical, and it appears nowhere in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Other fragments from Oxyrhynchus contained sayings scholars could not confidently place in any known text. Brief exchanges, short declarations, teachings that felt in their cadence and their moral weight, like things Jesus might have said, but which the canonical record had never preserved. This is where the scholarly concept known as the Agrapha becomes essential. The word comes from ancient Greek and means simply the unwritten things. But in the study of early Christianity, Agrapha refers specifically to sayings attributed to Jesus that circulated in the ancient world outside the boundaries of the four canonical Gospels. The Agrapha are not a modern invention, and they are not a fringe obsession. They have been studied seriously since at least the 17th century, and the catalog of known examples runs to well over 100 individual sayings, depending on which scholarly criteria are applied. Some Agrapha appear in the letters of Paul. In the book of Acts, Paul quotes Jesus saying, "It is more blessed to give than to receive," a saying found nowhere in the four Gospels. Some appear in the writings of early church fathers, men like Origen and Clement of Alexandria and Justin Martyr, who quoted Jesus in ways that do not precisely match any canonical verse. Some appear in the margins of ancient manuscripts, added by scribes who seemed to believe they were recording something authentic. And some appear in texts like the Gospel of Thomas, which early Christian communities clearly valued enough to copy, protect, and in some cases hide from destruction. The question historians face when confronting the Agrapha is not simply whether they exist. They clearly do. The question is how to evaluate them, how to think seriously about whether any of them might carry genuine historical memory of what Jesus said. Scholars approach this question with a set of analytical tools developed over more than a century of careful work. One of the primary tests is the criterion of multiple attestation. If a saying attributed to Jesus appears independently in more than one ancient source, with no clear evidence that one source simply copied from the other, its claim to historical authenticity becomes stronger. Another test is the criterion of dissimilarity. If a saying attributed to Jesus does not simply reflect the theological interests of the early church or the cultural assumptions of the surrounding world, if it is unexpected or even uncomfortable, it may be more likely to reflect something genuinely remembered rather than something invented to serve a later purpose. Applying these tests to the Agrapha produces results that are genuinely varied. Some sayings collapse under scrutiny. They reflect the concerns of 2nd or 3rd century theological debates rather than the world of 1st century Galilee. They feel constructed. Others are more resistant. They carry an awkward specificity, a rhetorical style, a moral sharpness that aligns closely with the teachings the canonical Gospels do preserve. The scholarly community does not speak with one voice on this question. Some historians conclude that the vast majority of non-canonical sayings are later compositions with little historical value. Others argue that a meaningful subset of the Agrapha may preserve genuine early tradition that simply failed to survive inside the boundaries of the canon. To understand why genuine early tradition might have been lost, it is necessary to understand something about the diversity of early Christianity and the complex historical process by which the canon was formed. The earliest followers of Jesus did not immediately sit down and write. For decades after his death, the primary mode of transmission was oral. Stories were told and retold. Teachings were memorized and passed from community to community by traveling missionaries and returning pilgrims. Different communities developed different emphases. Different leaders preserved different memories. And when the communities eventually did begin to write things down, they wrote with the concerns and questions and challenges of their own particular moment and place in mind. By the middle of the 1st century, the Apostle Paul was writing letters to communities he had founded or hoped to influence, letters that addressed immediate crises and theological questions. The Gospels as we know them were composed later, scholars generally placing Mark in the late 60s or early 70s, Matthew and Luke in the 80s, and John somewhere around the 90s of the 1st century. Each Gospel writer worked from a combination of sources, some written, some oral, some perhaps preserved only in the memory of aging eyewitnesses. And each writer made choices. What to include, what to emphasize, what to summarize, what to leave aside. The Gospel of Luke is unusually candid about this reality. Its opening lines acknowledge that many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that were fulfilled among those who followed Jesus, and that Luke himself, having carefully investigated everything, has chosen to write an orderly account. The implication is unmistakable. There were other accounts, other sources, other preserved memories from which Luke selected the material he found most reliable and most useful for his particular audience and purpose. What became of the materials Luke did not include? What became of the teachings other communities preserved that the eventual canon compilers did not know about, or did not find useful, or did not have access to? These are not conspiratorial questions. They are the natural questions of any serious historian confronting the gap between a vast living tradition and the finite documents that survived it. The canon formation process itself unfolded over several centuries and was shaped by factors that were simultaneously theological, political, geographical, and institutional. Certain texts gained authority because they were associated with apostolic authorship, whether actual or attributed. Others gained authority because they were widely used in worship across influential communities. The Bishop of Alexandria read and quoted certain texts. The Bishop of Rome recognized others. Communities that found themselves on the losing side of early theological disputes sometimes found that their preferred texts were excluded along with their theological positions. The scholar Elaine Pagels, who spent decades studying the Nag Hammadi texts, observed that the diversity of early Christian expression was far wider than most modern believers realize, and that the process of canon formation involved real human choices made by real human beings working under real historical pressures. This is not a radical claim. It is the consensus position of mainstream historical scholarship. The canon was formed through a process. Processes have participants. Participants have perspectives. None of this requires the conclusion that anything was hidden with malicious intent. The early church leaders who debated and defined the canon were, by every reasonable historical assessment, attempting to preserve what they believed was most authentically apostolic and most theologically sound. They worked with the sources available to them. They applied the criteria they had developed. They made decisions that reflected both genuine discernment and the inevitable limitations of their own moment in history. But limitations are real. Distance is real. The fact that a text was excluded from the final canon does not automatically mean it contained nothing of historical value. And the fact that a saying attributed to Jesus appears outside the four Gospels does not automatically mean it was invented. Consider the Gospel of Thomas more carefully. Scholarly opinion on its date and origin remains genuinely contested. Some scholars argue it was composed in the 2nd century and reflects a developed Gnostic theology that places it well outside the orbit of authentic early tradition. Others, including scholars like John Dominic Crossan and Stephen Davies, have argued that portions of Thomas may reflect traditions as early as the canonical Gospels themselves, possibly drawing on a common early source. If the latter position has merit, then sayings preserved only in Thomas carry a claim to serious historical consideration that cannot simply be dismissed. Among the sayings in Thomas that have no canonical parallel, some are startling in their directness. One speaks of the kingdom as already present within the one who seeks it, invisible to those who look only outward. Another describes the act of fasting from the world as a path to discovering something the world cannot take away. These ideas are not foreign to the canonical Jesus. They resonate with teachings about the kingdom of God that appear throughout Matthew and Luke. But the particular formulation, the specific emphasis, the precise compression of the language belongs to Thomas alone. What does it mean that communities existed in the 1st and 2nd centuries who read these sayings as the words of Jesus, who copied them carefully, bound them in leather, and buried them in sealed jars rather than allow them to be destroyed? At minimum, it means that the memory of Jesus was richer, wider, and more varied than any single document could contain. At minimum, it means that the tradition was alive in ways that overflowed the boundaries eventually drawn around it. The deeper question is one that no amount of archaeology or textual analysis can fully resolve. It is a question about memory and emphasis and the inevitable selectivity of transmission. Every tradition that survives across centuries must be carried by human beings. Human beings remember what moves them, what answers their questions, what speaks to their condition, and they emphasize, in the telling and the retelling, the things that matter most to them in their moment. This is not deception. It is the nature of memory itself. If early communities in Syria or Egypt or Mesopotamia preserved sayings of Jesus that communities in Rome or Carthage did not know or did not value, it is not necessary to imagine a conspiracy of silence. It is enough to imagine a vast, multilingual, geographically dispersed movement of people doing their best to hold on to something they believed was worth holding on to, in conditions of persecution and uncertainty and limited communication, across a span of time that stretched from the dusty roads of Galilee to the great councils of the Roman Imperial Church. What was held onto and what was let go, and what was pressed between the pages of history and left there, may never be fully known. The desert gives back its secrets slowly and incompletely. The jar at Nag Hammadi survived. The monastery that may have hidden it did not. The monks who buried those texts in the 4th century almost certainly believed they were protecting something sacred. They were right that someone would eventually come looking. They could not have known it would take 16 centuries. There is something extraordinary about the moment Muhammad Ali al-Saman lifted that sealed jar from the Egyptian earth. He did not know what he was holding. He did not know that inside those leather-bound pages were words that would send scholars around the world back to their desks with renewed urgency, rereading everything they thought they understood about the origins of Christianity, the formation of Scripture, and the memory of a man who walked through Galilee 2,000 years ago and said things that changed the world. Not all of what he said was written down. Not all of what was written down survived. Not all of what survived was included in the canon. These are not accusations. They are simply facts of history, sobering and irreducible. And so the question that remains, the question that no council and no commentary and no amount of scholarly argument has ever fully quieted, is this: if the words that were preserved were enough to reshape human civilization, to inspire cathedrals and hospitals and acts of extraordinary compassion across 2 millennia, what might the words that were not preserved have done? What might they still do if we are honest enough to keep looking, careful enough to listen without agenda, and humble enough to admit that the tradition we inherited, magnificent as it is, may be larger than the boundaries we drew around it? The desert keeps its silence. The jars are opened one by one, and somewhere in the space between what was recorded and what was lived, the search continues.